everyone I talk to thinks security questionnaires are a chore. And anyone who's sort of worked in that field where customers ask questions and then you have to like respond back, and it's in this like big Excel spreadsheet, which it's like writing prose in Excel is like some layer of hell that I don't want to find myself in. And I think the thing that I found about these security questionnaires, when I sort of started thinking about, well, do we want to use them for evaluating our vendors, is that it is almost never the case that they're actually used to change anything.
Hey there, and welcome to the Modern Security Podcast, where we interview security leaders building high-performing security programs. I'm your host, Clint Gibbler, the head of security research at SemGrep and the creator of the TLDRSec newsletter, where you can get the latest tools, blog posts, talks, and more in your inbox totally for free every week. So I had an awesome chat with my friend Alex Smolen, who is the director of security at LaunchDarkly. We got into a bunch of great things, such as the principles of how he thinks about security and running a security program, some things he sees security teams focus on that he doesn't believe are the most effective use of time. We talked about invariance, some concrete initiatives that LaunchDarkly pursued that can systematically raise the security bar and eliminate classes of vulnerabilities. And we closed with a spicy take about the topic of certain security conference talks. So before we get into it, a little bit of background about Alex. So he started as a software engineer, but then started taking on more and more security responsibilities. He was then a security consultant at Foundstone. He then joined Twitter's original security team, at one point being the tech lead for their authentication stack. He was then the first security hire at Clever, where he built the security program and hired the team. And of course, most recently, he is the director of security at LaunchDarkly. So we had an awesome chat. I hope you enjoy. Let's get into it.
I think it's helpful to have that kind of empathy for the people that you're trying to support. Similarly, like in corporate security, I've found that people who used to work in IT who are really interested in security tend to be really good, rather than like someone who's like has a security background per se. It's just like you want to kind of have that empathy so that you can make sure that what you're recommending or suggesting is palatable and sensible. And I think there's also a big issue of like empowerment. For me, I want my security teams to be able to do kind of anything that they are going to ask someone else to do potentially. So like if we need a vulnerability fixed, I want our application security team to be empowered to make that fix themselves. Similarly with like our corporate security team, if we need to go in and change something in Okta, like I want us to be able to do that. Now, we don't always necessarily need to do that. And sometimes it doesn't make sense for us to do that because like the expertise lies with the other team. It's important to have them maintain that expertise, but it feels really important to me. And like, I think that there's a real value from having like a more strong, just pure security background. I remember back when I was a consultant in my early days as a consultant, I was brought in as sort of this like software security person. And it was a team of like a lot of people who had a lot of deep familiarity with network security and had run a lot of pen tests. And I remember at one point, everyone was in a room in this big meeting, and they were talking about like, I don't know, Nessus versus Nmap or something. And I like raised my hand and I'm like, what are these tools? Like, I don't know. And like, it was one of those moments where everyone turned their head around and looked at me like, who let this guy in here, I think that's, there's definitely some trade-off, I think, from not having kind of like the, more deep security expertise and familiarity with all the tools and all the jargon and all the culture even. But yeah, I like to be exposed to that as well. And I think over the course of my career, I've been able to kind of like learn from people with kind of more, purely security focused backgrounds. And yeah, I think there's important things to learn from both sides.
Definitely. One thing you said that I was curious to know a little bit more about is I also like the idea of the security team having the knowledge and authority to like, oh, we didn't just find an issue, we're also fixing it. But I'm curious how you think of that in terms of um, I guess like prioritizing the security team's time, maybe to make it more concrete. Let's say like bug bounty or pen test. Like, hey, there's this issue in like the code, or maybe it's like a cloud issue or something like that. But um, I assume that there's many more developers than security team members at LaunchDarkly. So like even if maybe you could fix all the things. I'm curious, like, when do you think of like, hey, we should fix this versus we should empower and contextualize and make it like super clear how to fix it, but maybe delegating that to engineering teams and getting it on their roadmap. Um, so yeah, I'm curious how you think of like how to, given limited person time, like how much of this, in what cases would we fix it versus we would partner to have the engineering team fix it?
Yeah. Um, I think one of the things that I think about, it's a question that has a lot of different factors. Uh, so there's a question of the urgency. Is this something that is, for me, like a big distinction is like a vulnerability versus a finding. And we use that language to mean two distinct things. A vulnerability is essentially uh, an actual scenario or sort of an actual weakness that allows an attacker to potentially achieve an objective that violates our what we want to be true from a security perspective. And so that's something that like might come in via HackerOne, via our bug bounty, or we might discover during a pen test, or might discover internally. And that's something that generally has a relatively high urgency because we know that it's a real issue, versus say findings where we run a tool and it says you have 1,000 different security, high, medium, low, which if you've been working in security long enough, you have a healthy skepticism about how many of those actually translate into vulnerabilities. And it's always a little bit, of course, of a what is it, like Schrodinger's box, where it's like you don't really know if a finding is a vulnerability until you investigate it. And that's often, I think, the thing that requires so much time from a security team. It's like if you get 1,000 findings, to go in and actually investigate each of those and triage them can be incredibly expensive. And some of the things I've talked about, in previous talks and things like that, is kind of like how to apply automation to help address that issue. But one of the things that I think, if you do have a vulnerability, say, there's a question of like, who is able to fix this vulnerability the most quickly. I like to operate with a sense of urgency. I think it's just kind of like part of my nature that like I want to um, like resolve and move on to the next thing. And so if we do have an issue, there's kind of this incentive misalignment with engineering teams where like people kind of recognize that they should be doing things that the security team asked them to do, and they have other stuff that is their sort of primary job, right? Like, and so you can try to influence people to say like, hey, we need to fix this vulnerability because here's the impact and things like that. But there can be let's say some amount of effort required, and then that translates into latency. So it's like, oh well, I should talk to my manager about this, I need to talk to my product manager about this, I need to and I think so that's kind of like one part of the struggle is like, if you rely on other teams all the time to actually change things, and all security does is just illuminate risk but doesn't actually address risk, then like you can end up in this sort of like very isolated, disempowered, and it makes me kind of crabby feeling of like they're like I can't do anything. Like I see all these problems and no one's listening to me, and woe was me, something's going to go wrong, and then I'm going to get blamed for it. And like that is not a position I like to be in, and so I want our team to be able to, in that scenario where like we feel like things aren't being addressed sufficiently urgently, to be able to come in and do whatever is necessary to address a vulnerability. And I think that also kind of is just sort of part of my, maybe it's from consulting, where like we just be like, sent a 100 megabyte zip file of Java code or PHP or whatever, and go and spend 3 weeks and report back all the security vulnerabilities. And like you just learn how to operate in very unknown circumstances. And so, my expectation is that security engineers are able to rapidly learn and, enough to be sort of, again, dangerous in, different languages, platforms, things like that, front end, back end, data engineering is we were talking about earlier. And, because I think that, again, like it is so helpful to be able to, not like kind of be relying on other people to solve the problems that matter to you. If the problems matter to you, you should be able to make an impact on them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and we'll talk in a little bit about how to maybe help that at scale. But yeah, moving on to sort of principles about how you think about security. One of the things you said, which I really like, is it's about enabling businesses to operate at an acceptable level of risk. And maybe there's even an element of like leaning into the risk. But yeah, could you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think like the spicy version of this was that like like our job is actually to like let businesses increase risk rather than like try to reduce risk, which is like not 100% true. It's like provocative, I guess, but I think it's something that sometimes like when you have a bad reputation, you need to kind of like lean into almost like the polar opposite of it to really sort of like actually find a middle road. It could also be like a tendency that you might have, and you're like, so you sort of practice taking the opposite perspective. And I think for a lot of security teams, and again, security teams that I've been a part of as well, questioning some of your assumptions and saying, what would it look like if actually what we were trying to do was not just like, sort of find and reduce risk, but really sort of like think about ways that we can take on sort of meaningful new projects and feel comfortable with the level of risk that they represent. And yeah, because so something that was, I think, a really important consensus that the LaunchDarkly security team came to early on. We were thinking about OKRs and like, what do we work on? And that's a really interesting question in on a lot of different teams. Like, what do we work on? What's the priority? But security teams, especially because it's so difficult to get reliable sort of data about what's working, what's not working. And so, every planning session, we'd sort of come up with a list of ideas. Oh, that sounds good. Oh, yeah, I like that idea. But, they would change and things like that. And so what was helpful for us was to kind of come up with what we think of as these durable goals that don't change. And what we recognized was that like reducing risk is really just one of those durable goals. It's important that we don't want bad things to happen. But there's like other stuff that we found ourselves doing that was not about reducing risk, that was important to the business. And those things, we wanted to like make sure that we were being recognized for the work that we were doing against them, because we felt like it was valuable. So the second of those durable goals was to assure the customer, which, looks like getting our, SOC 2 ISO 27001 FedRAMP certification, or, writing security blog posts or answering security questionnaires and things of that nature. None of that actually reduces risk. per se. It might, as a side effect, actually reduce risk. But what generally the reason why we might do a handful of things related to compliance is because we want the certificate we can show our customers. The third durable goal is to make things go faster, to be able to have what we're doing as a company happen more quickly. And that can be on the sort of development side, that could be on the corporate operations side, or that can be on sort of like the GRC, sales cycle, customer questionnaires, things of that nature. So all those things exist as parameters that for any given set of resources and a context, like we may want to solve different problems. And I guess, so when I think about the idea of like increasing risk, like it may be that if we can, do something where we're, building a new product, say building a new product does increase risk. And like you want to support organizations generally building new products. And you want them to do it quickly. If you sort of apply a bunch of security steps during the new product creation process, I've found that like you get you can be rejected because most new products don't work out. And so I think there's just a lot of different things that a security team does. And I just find that it's important to, sometimes like think about ways where you can maybe take an opposite perspective on what like people might classically think a security team does.
Yeah, I like that framing. I feel most security professionals are very aware about reducing risk, but I also like the second and third of assuring the customer and speeding up value delivery. Definitely for the assuring the customer, I've seen that as well, like at my day job at SemGrep, where, we are, the buyer is often security teams, almost always security teams, and they're obviously very cognizant of the security posture of vendors. So our internal security team focusing on doing all the right things and making strong decisions helps sales team as well. So it's really like overall helping the company succeed. So I like that. And I think like rather than having sort of like a single metric of success, like reducing risk, because if that's the only thing you care about, then anything that reduces risk, or at least reducing as much risk as possible, like is strictly always a good thing. However, if it's counterbalanced by, enabling the business to ship things faster and to win customers and retain customers, then there's like this like balancing function where it's like, well, yes, this thing is reducing risk, but it's making development processes like 20% slower, and we're paying them a lot of money, and it means we're shipping new features more slowly, and maybe our competitor is going to get ahead of us. So like maybe that reduction of risk is like not acceptable to the business, actually, given like helping the business win. So I don't know. I think about that more these days in terms of like counterbalancing goals. I forget, I feel like there's a term in this, but something about like there's like metric and then like some sort of counterbalancing metric or objective, which makes it more balanced and doesn't have you go off the deep end in one direction.
Yeah, I describe them as kind of like being in tension, and sort of like providing stability against each other so that one doesn't, turn into like some, perverse maximization where you end up, ignoring something else that's really important. Also, in terms of thinking about our role as not necessarily reducing risk, one of the things that I find is really important is to take questions that traditionally someone in charge of security might be asked to say yes or no to, and really shifting that to say we do not say yes or no. Like if you want to onboard a new vendor, or if you want to make this design decision in your new feature, or you want to have a customer sign a contract that says XYZ, we will present the risks, and then we can sort of like escalate it if there's not consensus to people who have a broader perspective of the business. But I don't want us to be in a position where we're saying yes or no, really, or specifically no to things like that. Like I view my job as sort of like clarifying risk, and then the business gets to make the decision about whether it's acceptable. Now, in practice, there may be times where like I tap my boss on the shoulder and say like, "This is a horrible idea. Like we should really kibosh this." But from sort of like sometimes I think about security functions, and again, maybe this is because I spent too long thinking about code or something like that. But like, it's sort of like there's like a inputs and output interfaces, right? And so like that the output for us, yeah, I don't want it to be like no, which I guess is not maybe a novel concept, but I do find that people want to hear a yes or a no. They sort of want that certainty. Like there's a lot of like, oh, did security approve it? And we'll talk later about approvals, I hope, but like I don't think that like that kind of like occludes the nuance of that risk is essentially something that always exists at some level, and that it's either accepted or not. And so if there's just kind of like a checkbox, it I find that it sort of isolates us again from the rest of the organization that needs to be thinking about this.
Yeah, actually, along those lines, we were talking about, what are some things you see security teams focus on that you think may not actually help or may not be worth the time. I think you were talking about like security questionnaires and maybe approval workflows. So yeah, I want to hear maybe some like lightly spicy takes, or just however you would like to frame them.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about working as kind of like the like the first person at a security organization or like at a growing security team and sort of like building out practices is that you get to question things. And I think for me it's I think really useful to have like some sort of skepticism around the value of the things that everyone is doing, or that it seems like everyone is doing. And yeah, so for me, like I guess the the controversiality of a take is related to that. Like I perceive that other people who work in security are like, well, we all do this. It's the right thing to do. It's just kind of like common sense. And so yeah, I mean, I guess everyone I talk to thinks security questionnaires are a chore. And anyone who's sort of worked in that field where customers ask questions and then you have to like respond back, and it's in this like big Excel spreadsheet, which like it's like writing prose in Excel is like some layer of hell that I don't want to find myself in. And I think the thing that I found about these security questionnaires when I sort of started thinking about, well, do we want to use them for evaluating our vendors? Is that it is almost never the case that they're actually used to change anything. So these questionnaires go back and forth, and you're sort of required to go in and answer the questions. And a lot of times you will get these questions that are completely sort of separated from the context of the way that you run your business. And so you'll answer them, but like the answer is not necessarily meaningful. Do you encrypt all data at rest? Like is sort of one of those things that, what do you mean by all data? What do you mean by encryption? And so the question and answer is missing all the context that allows you to make a meaningful sort of observation of risk. And so instead you end up with this kind of like back and forth process that is bureaucratic in nature. And again, like no one's really changing anything. No one's like, oh, like I guess I need to go encrypt all my data at rest, right? Like maybe you realize that you need to do that, but I think that there's better mechanisms for that. Things like audits, where like you have actually someone going in and gathering evidence rather than just like having you sort of like state that you're doing something. And so yeah, I just found them to not be valuable. And I think that there's things that are likely way more important around thinking about vendors. And so one of those things is just like good documentation. One of the challenges that we find is like, someone's like, hey, like we want to bring in this new, air tracking software that like lives in our JS and like gives us all this fancy way of tracking JavaScript errors. It's like, okay, that's great. The answer is not for me to go and send that company a big long questionnaire about how they do data security. I think that like generally something like SOC 2 provides sort of like a floor for that. From my perspective, a better approach is to say, can we understand how we're using this organization? And that comes up in sort of a couple contexts. One is like, do we have an asset inventory of like the vendors that we're using? And is that asset inventory usable in the sense of like, let's say, hey, like this company, some company had a breach. Can we do like a query and say, are we using that company? And if so, who can we go talk to? And in what context are we using that organization? And that gets into things like sort of data flows and IAM. And that's where I find, if you could take the energy spent on security questionnaires and spend it on documentation of data flows and IAM for vendors, I think that would be so much better in operating in a reduced risk environment, because like that's where, I found a lot of sort of our problems around vendors can occur. It's like, oh, actually we set up this vendor where it has a service account where it has administrative access to XYZ, or, oh, we started sending data from this data source to this vendor. And like, that's the problem. Not that this vendor, doesn't have, their laptops lock after 15 minutes of inactivity or whatever. So anyways, another thing that I found is useful with vendors is like the concept of brown M&Ms is like this piece of I believe it's true from like the Van Halen tour writer, where they would say we want a bowl of M&Ms backstage, but no brown M&Ms in there. It was kind of like buried deep in the contract. And the idea was if they got backstage and there was no bowl of M&Ms, or there was a bowl of M&Ms but there were brown M&Ms in there, then like it was a signal that there was a bunch of other stuff that could go wrong with the show, and they would like cause a fit, right? Which is kind of like a messed up thing to do, but like the clever idea behind it, I think, is useful from the perspective of thinking about security, which is like, okay, like basically anyone can get a SOC 2 if they sort of spend enough money to find a company that will handhold them through it. But there's a lot that you can learn about an organization just by looking at externally visible security settings. Looking at things like SSL labs and security headers, looking at email settings and domain settings, things that like you can scan for that like kind of give you a sense, does this company take security seriously? Now there's organizations out there that sort of like profess to do something like this, a security scorecard or something like that. I feel like what I ended up doing was cobbling something together that was, just sort of like a script that collates several of these different external scanners that is, costs approximately $0. And again, like from my perspective, gives us a kind of a signal that we can use to then say, okay, well, what sort of like what class of security do we think this vendor likely has based on observable signals?
Yeah, that makes sense. I like the idea of inferring security posture based on observable signals, and to your point, like quality of docs and other things. If I were to try to summarize or maybe rephrase your sort of key arguments against security questionnaires, and feel free to correct me. Like, I think you're saying, like, so if you're the security team receiving the security questionnaire, oftentimes the questions don't necessarily, they're not like relevant from like a business or product point of view in terms of like really asking the right questions, because it's probably a generic questionnaire. And then for you asking other your vendors things, it's like, well, depending on how much the business need is, probably, like, say for example it's like an engineering tool, like unless the security, unless the answers are egregiously bad, you're probably going to use it anyway. And even if there's some things that you don't like about what they do, you're probably not going to change the security posture of that company, or they're not going to like change their security practices for you as a part of like the vendor security questionnaire, unless you were maybe like a FANG or like manga company that's like, I'm about to give you $10 million, so like you need to do these things.
Yeah, I think, there's the like, I think the best approach I've seen to security questionnaires is the Google open source security questionnaire. I forget the name of it.
Yeah.
I think the questions are pretty good, and it's like a web form, and it's like actually has like functionality built in to sort of say like you need to actually go change this if you have the wrong answer. Yeah, in a lot of cases there are power dynamics at play here that can shift the utility of like having specific requirements for an organization. But the way, like, what I'm talking about is kind of like the 80% rule of security questionnaires. From my experience, most of them are paper shuffling. Like, they don't actually provide a lot of value, again, beyond something like an audit, where there's actual evidence involved, and someone, a qualified auditor who's assessing it. So again, I think it's something that exists from a slightly different era, that also exists, from as kind of like a cargo culture from organizations that had that power differential, right? So like, you see some big organization that has a security questionnaire because they can, and they can like go and force organizations unilaterally to go do things like, install an antivirus on their Linux servers or whatever. And so then what I guess, like, as you sort of think of like the small scrappy startup, which I don't necessarily think LaunchDarkly is anymore, but like, that's kind of the value that I want to bring to, I think, any of our thinking is like, what's the actual utility that we're trying to get out of this security control? And so anyways, like, again, maybe it's controversial. I hope it's controversial. In some way, I would love to, see a reduction in kind of like unnecessary burdensome work that, like, I find just like, creates like a scaling bottleneck for security teams, where like you need to start to scale linearly the size of your security organization with like the number of customers you have, which to me is like, you don't want to do the same in engineering, or I think in a lot of other functions. Like, you want to figure out ways to sort of like, again, like, if we can go and get like SOC 2 and show that like we have this amazing security, that like any security questionnaire is, like completely meaningless now. That's maybe a one-time investment that would scale much better, because then we would just sort of point to this certification. Now, again, certifications have their own sets of problems, and as someone who is kind of like, taken on the challenge of maintaining our certifications, like that sucks too, but
maybe it's
I think it's a better solution.
I wonder, I like where you're going with that. Maybe there's not like a certification like a SOC 2++, but in terms of external factors or like one-time work things, like, I wonder, is there potentially an argument here for security teams at companies writing some awesome blog posts about like, hey, here's how we think about security, here's the specific mechanisms we built, and maybe giving conference talks or things like that. And if you're thinking about having that company as a vendor and you go to their engineering blog and you see some like awesome posts from their security team, you can like read it and be like, yeah, like it's maybe not perfect because no company is, but like, wow, they're like very thoughtful. Look at some cool stuff they built. Look how they think about it. And in some respects, I almost wonder if that's like a better security signal than like a specific certification. Like, I don't know, like think of like the Netflix engineering blog, Segment engineering blog. I've seen some cool stuff from like Canva and like Slack as well. So I don't know. I feel like there's ways to show like, hey, we're doing cool stuff.
Yeah. I mean, this is kind of the assure the customer piece, which like can translate to security marketing, right? Like, how do we deliver the message to the people that we care about that we're running a tight security ship? I think in general, a big problem I have with third-party security is that we're terrible at first-party security, like, and terrible in the sense that like it's really hard, right? And like we don't have certainty about our own risk, right? Like we still have a lot of kind of like guessing, essentially, that we do. And if we're not able to determine our own risk very well, then like we don't stand a chance of being able to like figure out the risk associated with like some random third party. And so again, I see that happening in sort of like the certification process where there's a lot of focus on things that like don't necessarily translate into risk. But yeah, no, I generally think that if we can figure out ways to kind of like what do we as experts use to predict? So I think what you were talking about is like if I wanted to figure out whether a company had good security or not, what do? I like go on their website, click on something that says security, read it. Like, does that sound like they know what they're talking about? Maybe I'd be like, oh, like they have this link to this talk at like a reputable security conference. Like oh, the signal goes up. Maybe I might go and like look on LinkedIn and like, do they have a security team? Or like look on their job postings. Like, are they hiring for a security team? Like that can tell you a lot about how they think about security as an organization. None of that is like captured in a security questionnaire or a certification. But I think it's actually what we would do kind of like independent of these formal processes. So like, how do we take this knowledge that we already have about how to make decisions and start to describe it, start to systematize it? Because I think we have an instinct that that's actually the right way to do things, but it's sort of like an art. It's like, it's something that like those who have been doing it long enough know. And yeah, I think it would be a great way. It is something that we try to embed within our process. But again, it's a little like soft and squishy. And so I don't, part of me is like also like wonders how open not only, a lot of security teams and leaders are, but like, the people who operate around them, like how much courage do we have to do something different? And, especially in a world where people are risk averse, they don't understand how security works. What they really want to see is like, we're doing security like other organizations are doing security. And so like, we're not going to get in trouble because we're doing something different. So anyways, it's a very, when you find yourself in a position where you're now in charge of vendor security and figuring out how we do this, again, I think you can sort of take this approach of like, well, let's see what everyone else is doing. Or you could just say like, let's maybe, start with a skeptical bias and figure out what actually achieves the objectives we're trying to achieve.
Totally. Yeah, I like that. So I would love to chat about invariance, but very quickly before we do that, do you want to share some thoughts on approval workflows in just like a minute?
Yeah. So I guess this is like just something that I also want to see a reduction in. When you look at a lot of security tools, they ask you, a big feature is like, oh, you can build approvals. So, if someone wants access to something now, rather than just like having to grant them access, they can like ask for it and then someone has to go and approve it. And I generally think that doesn't work very well at scale, your manager doesn't know if you need access to something any better than you do, or someone on the security team does. So for me, what this is really, it's like change management. Like, I don't have access to this thing. I want access to this thing. And the big missing thing in approvals is like, what is the context behind that? And so, I think that like something like a pull request is a way better way to do an access request. Obviously, pull requests require a certain amount of like engineering skill or background, and so that doesn't always work. But like one of the things that I think might have a better set of trade-offs than an approval workflow would be like having audit logs with some sort of like detection as code. So it's like people have access to this, but when they use it, like it shows up and it creates this responsibility or accountability, I guess. Now that assumes someone's looking at those audit logs, and it also, but like the nice thing about it is like it removes the friction point, which like approvals, you ask for approval and then you wait, and like someone's on vacation. Like when you put an approval workflow in like it just slows things down. And the other thing I would call out is that I think a place where approvals make sense is sort of the concept of emergency break glass. So when you think of like what a emergency break glass is, like you have to break the glass because it should be very, very clear that like it's an emergency. And so there's like this kind of one way, super visible, it's noisy, you see glass on the floor. And so there, I think like that kind of like makes sense, where it's like if you need something exceptional, maybe you have an approval flow in case of an incident or something like that. But like for regular day-to-day work, I think they just slow things down. I think people get into this sort of rote habit of approving things. And I think there's better ways to build stuff like that.
Yeah, I think I agree that you probably, in many cases, it's not always obvious who has the most context to know if this person should be able to do this activity. But one thing I do like about those workflows is like giving people time-bound access to something and auto-revoking things that are not used within a certain time frame or something. Because otherwise, like if permissions just sort of lounge around, then that person is compromised like a year later. They still have access to things that they haven't used for a year, but now the attacker has access to those because it was never removed. So those are maybe orthogonal to the approval workflow, but there is something nice about just-in-time, time-bound, and like auto-revoking permission stuff.
Yeah, and I think like some sort of like self-approval workflow where you're like, hey, like I need to check out this, permission from the library and like carry it around for a while, and then I'll bring it back. And that showing up in sort of like audit logs and stuff like that can be helpful. But I think again, like when you start to ask managers or try to distribute out the sort of responsibility for who has access to what, like that is such a hard problem to answer. Who should have access to what? Because like, there's sort of no real there's so many different resources. Things are changing over time. There's reorgs, everything like that. And so, yeah, just like punting on the problem and saying like someone else figure it out feels like it feels like a cop out in some way. And so from my perspective, like I would rather spend more time focusing on defining really good role-based access control, having certain things where you need to sort of create annotated audit logs of like, here's why I needed to do this certain things, having certain truly dangerous permissions be behind kind of like an emergency break glass where it's like you need to do a postmortem of why you needed this access. But yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Let's talk about invariance. So by that meaning something that's perhaps always true or never true. Another common concept is like ratcheting, where you sort of set the security bar at a certain place, and then all new things need to abide by whatever the security policy is. And then you have like a backlog that you gradually wear down over time. I had a nice chat with a dev at Figma, which we can maybe link here. No, I don't know if the editor is going to do that, but yeah. So I think this idea of invariance and ratcheting is awesome. And one point you made was, invariants are actually like very hard. So yeah, could you give some examples of cases in which establishing some very useful security invariant can be quite hard?
Yeah. I think I'm trying to establish security invariance as a brand or something. I don't know that the terminology is used a ton, but I think there's a lot of people who are talking about similar ideas. And so I'll just describe the way that I think about it. And it's sort of a shape that I've noticed when solving security problems that I think is useful to sort of recognize, kind of a design pattern, essentially. Let's say that you decide as a team that you want everyone to, use WebAuthn for two-factor, right? Like the WebAuthn, sort of like phishing proof factor. If you have that in your flow, then it makes it less likely that you're going to deal with sort of like a classic phishing attempt where someone sends the MFA code to the wrong sort of like man in the middle or something like that. So you want everyone to use WebAuthn. That is by itself not a particularly great sort of scenario for an invariant because it doesn't have enough context to really describe if it's true or not. Like ideally, what you can do with an invariant is look at a data source, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, like how you might operationalize this. But you want to be able to have some evidence that this invariant is 100% true, not just that like at one point you kind of like did some best effort thing to make it true. So you want everyone to use WebAuthn. First, who are all the people, right? Like who are you targeting? And this, can be a really challenging problem around the edges, right? So clearly you're like, okay, well, everyone who is maybe an employee at this company. Well, okay, what about, contractors? What about, people when they show up on their first day and need to sign in, right? There's a lot of questions around which people are sort of like, we going to hold this invariant for? And then, the second question might be, well, what resources are within the circle, right? There may be a bunch of different places that people sign in that don't support WebAuthn, for example. And so like, what do we do with that? And then, what happens, like, let's say if someone, accidentally loses their token, right, which is known to happen in any sort of authentication scheme. There's presumably some way for them to recover. What does that look like? And again, how can you, the goal with all this is to answer these questions, not just to answer these questions, but to come up with a query, like something that you can represent in data land, that you can, exclude things that are not true explicitly. Because otherwise you end up in a world where it's like, okay, well, yeah, people use WebAuthn. Oh, but there's this one person who decided not to use it because, they just joined, or they're in this country where we couldn't ship it to them or something along those lines. And so when that invariant is true, then you're in this really great state where you have this clarity around the problem and the way that you're solving it. Another complication of like this problem might be that you would run into very likely is around service accounts, which might be called non-human identities or something similar. But like in general, there's a bunch of accounts in a typical SaaS organization that has a bunch of SaaS pointing at each other through integrations. And so these things, they're service accounts. They're built in a way where they're sort of like human accounts. They're expected to be operated by a human. So they have an email address and they have a password and they have an MFA and all this stuff that makes sense for a human being, but they're actually used to integrate, I don't know, like Zapier with Jira or something like that, right? And so like, how do you manage these accounts? They can't necessarily go in and like pulse a hardware token, and if you have a hardware token that like actually belongs to like, oh, here's the owner of the service account, well, that might make sense for a little while. But like as organizations change, maybe that person's on vacation, maybe they leave. And so, then what you need to say is, okay, well, maybe we'll do something different for service accounts. Well, how do you know which accounts are service accounts and which accounts are not service accounts? Right. And this kind of gets into this whole world of thinking about these entities in your asset inventory as structured data, and like being able to then, in like very concrete, sort of non like, like to have clarity in the actual data schema around how you think about these things from a security perspective.
Yeah, I love the way you're formulating things in terms of we have these assumptions where we have these properties that we want to hold, and then thinking about it in terms of like questions or queries, obviously leading into like asset inventory. So yeah, let's dig into that a little bit more. I think before this you called it like a asset security data lake. So yeah, be curious to let's dive into that.
Yeah, the ASDL, which I don't think that's gonna catch on, but I guess the reason why that name came to mind is one of the things that we wanted to do but couldn't find a sort of existing product or project to support us in doing, was understanding sort of how invariants, how our invariants were doing for our various assets that we cared about. And one of the things that I became exposed to and became, pretty engaged with, was sort of modern ways of doing data engineering. The problem I ran into was like dealing with cloud security and looking at CloudTrail, which was like super important to be able to do things like, who's using what permissions, and a lot of different detections and things like that you might want to build out of CloudTrail. But like for sufficiently large AWS footprints, CloudTrail is not something that you can put into a relational database very easily. It's not something that you can put into sort of like an indexed search cluster, something like Elasticsearch or Splunk, very easily without sort of like ending up paying a lot for ingest. And so, one of the big shifts in sort of like technology architecture has been sort of like separating out like the storage from the compute of data stores, so that you don't necessarily like you sort of throw a bunch of stuff into a store and then only sort of like pay resources to deal with it when you actually need to extract something out of it. And so this like general concept of a security data lake is super useful for dealing with logs. And like, I wrote about how you could use Athena to deal with CloudTrail. And then I think there's a lot of great options now to ingest CloudTrail. Although I still think that like CloudTrail, there's an opportunity to build a way better interface over them. Like, hey, this role did these 10 things. Like, I still feel like that's really hard to do with a lot of modern tooling. Anyways, so this idea of a security data lake is super useful for dealing with large volumes of data, and also for like not needing to necessarily worry about like figuring out the schema up front. But so a lot of people who have built security data lakes, this is what they build. It's like a way to sort of like throw a crap ton of logs into a data store and then, write queries against them.
And I think one of the key insights is it's different than a SIM in terms of like it's only detection logs. It's like, imagine everything in your business. Maybe there's cloud stuff. There's maybe detection signal. There's maybe I think you'll talk about this in a second, like information about the development processes, maybe PRs, GitHub repos, vulnerabilities from various tools. It's like everything about the company in the same place, rather than like isolated tools.
Yeah, it's really about kind of like getting all the core nouns that your security program cares about into a table that you can write joined SQL queries against. So you think about like your employees, right? Maybe they live in like Active Directory or Okta or something like that. And certainly you can go and look them up in those systems. But, if you want to do something like say, hey, like, over here, I have like, a CloudTrail log or an EC2 instance owner tag or something like that, that like maybe maps to like a group of employees. Like, how can I join those data? How can I join that data together? And, you essentially kind of end up having to do something custom, like calling an API or something like that. And so the idea is to take basically, all of these core nouns and put them into a data store. And because they're sort of from disparate sources, that's why sort of this data lake architecture makes sense, because you sort of can be liberal with the schema and the evolution of the schema over time. Thinking about like an employee, right, is like a core noun. A device that an employee has is like a core noun. A server that you use, or maybe a container image, a GitHub repository, and then things that are a little bit more theoretical, something like a vulnerability or an incident, or things that are important for your security program that you want to measure, that you want to have invariance against. Like, hey, we remediate all medium risk vulnerabilities within 90 days or whatever it is. Well, how do you know that? Like, how can you sort of like demonstrate that? How can you know when you're not doing that, right? And like, you can kind of like in your vulnerability tool do something like that. But again, what I find is that this shape of problem of like dealing with an invariant can be sort of like cleanly expressed across a wide variety of security problems if everything is in the same data format and in the same sort of data platform. And so that's the idea behind this asset security data lake. And the way that we built this was we started by sort of talking with our data team that had built business intelligence, for lack of a better term, for a lot of the rest of the organization, answering questions like, which customer has, the most, support tickets within the last 90 days or something along those lines. So they need to sort of like do this similar thing of like taking data from disparate systems, making it available with visualizations and things of that nature. So they're like, we use Snowflake. And we're like, cool, we'll use Snowflake. And we were like, okay, well, like, how do we get, like, for instance, AWS data into Snowflake? And we found this tool called Cloud Query that allows you to sort of, it's like a command line tool that allows you to say, tell me about all of the EC2 instances at this point in time. And it like outputs a bunch of JSON. So we run that, as a recurring job in Fargate for a variety of things, not just AWS. And, one of the things that does, though, it's sort of like a sampling problem where it gives you this snapshot every time that it runs. But the nature of these assets is they sort of are continuous in the sense that like things come and go. And especially when you have something like, EC2 instances that are auto scaling, then that can be a real problem. And the analogy that we talk about on our team is like the ship of Theseus, which like it's sort of this like philosophical question of if you have a ship and then you like remove every board and replace it with a new board and eventually do that for all the boards of the ship, is it still the same ship? And we have that question, for instance, if we're looking at like vulnerabilities in a auto-scaling group of EC2 instances, where it's like any individual EC2 instance has only been up for like a few hours, but like the vulnerability has been around for weeks. And so it's like, if you just measure by how long the vulnerability has existed on the EC2 instance, because they have this ephemeral lifetime, like it creates this sort of data problem around the way that you might think about how you want to evaluate your vulnerabilities. There's also issues around, for us, like making sure that we can take different sources of data and combine them into useful views. So we use a tool called DBT, which was something our data team was using to sort of combine different source data into views. That also, helps account for the fact that you have these kind of different dates of these snapshots, combining them together and doing things like, maybe you want some view to be materialized so that it's, faster to query for things like visualizations. And yeah, for visualization, we use Snowsight, which is not super awesome. We're looking at maybe some different options there to help us kind of get better insight around the data. But yeah, so all this, by the way, kind of combines with the idea of ratcheting, which I think is also incredibly important from the perspective of these invariants. So like when we say, hey, all of our EC2 instances should have a reverse uptime of 90 days or 30 days or whatever. So like that, we're going to get some, let's say, number of EC2 instances that do not follow that invariant. And in general, that's okay. You can kind of like have exceptions and an invariant can still be true as long as the exceptions are documented and can be expressed and justified. And it's not like something where it's like, oh yeah, this person said it was okay, but there's no record of it, right? But how do we make sure that over time the problem doesn't get worse, right? So we can sort of say the backlog we will address over time, but that ratchet is like, how do we make sure that like over time, like the number of invariants goes down rather than up? And so for us, that might involve something like, making a change to the base image so that it, automatically terminates after a certain amount of time, or like building, supporting better deployment processes for certain services that, people have a hard time deploying. So that's like a ratchet that exists there. And the security team at LaunchDarkly has embraced this, with GitHub. We've found that to be a really useful leverage point for thinking about security. So, we have our set of invariants for our GitHub repositories, things like, it has to have branch protection. It has to follow sort of our access model. It should do things like create a software bill of materials. It should run our SaaS tooling. It should have required topics so that we can do things like determine sort of what repositories have sort of what qualities. And so that's what we want our GitHub repositories to look like. But when someone goes and creates a new GitHub repository, it doesn't follow any of those things. So what we've done is we created the Terraform module and we moved all of our GitHub repository management to Terraform. And so now when someone wants to create a new repository, rather than going and clicking on the new repository button in GitHub, they're able to go and use Terraform to do this. And it also relies on the GitHub repository template, but we just find in general, Terraform has a lot of properties that we like around, being able to detect changes, and sort of investigate changes.
Nice. So, so people cannot just click new to create a new repo. Instead, I guess you have a GitHub repo that is the Terraform of every other GitHub repo, which someone submits a PR to. And then in that Terraform module, it has properties for all the awesome security-based primitives you just mentioned in terms of SAST, SBOM, branch protection, and so forth.
Yeah, although that's kind of the other piece of invariance that like people can theoretically still go in and click new repository. So what you also want to do, so there's okay, you implement the capability to measure the invariant. Mm-hmm. You generate exceptions and have rationale behind them in a way that where the invariant can be true right now with the set of known exceptions that you're going to burn down over time. Then you create this ratchet where you're okay, well, for new stuff, it's going to follow this invariant sort of by default. But then you presumably also have a way where someone could go and do something that doesn't follow the golden path. And so there you need detection. And so that's where having GitHub logs in a SIM and being able to say, hey, new repository created without, required topics or something along those lines, or it doesn't have, XYZ standard enabled. Obviously you could find that eventually by looking at your invariance dashboard, but like that's something where like we found that like, uh, yeah, there's all sorts of like detections that we find super valuable around just like, hey, like someone is wandered off the path and they're doing something. Like, let's go talk to them. And that's not like, we're not looking for attackers. We're just like, you know, maybe like we're wrong. Maybe our golden path isn't so golden, right? And so it's just an opportunity to learn from each other that's contextual. And so yeah, that's the kind of other piece of invariance that I think is really important.
Yeah, I like the idea of you provide the nice path, but also observing continuously, like, is it being followed or not? Or is there perhaps some things that are too hard that you can change to make it easier? One thing I just wanted to highlight briefly that you mentioned a second ago is, so you're like, okay, cool. We have a bunch of data of a bunch of different things that we want to store and query and things like that. And like, oh, our data team, that's their bread and butter. That's what they do. They've already done this for a bunch of business intelligence type things. Like, why don't we learn from them? And rather than set up a totally separate, parallel, unrelated, maybe data lake tool or ingest software or visualization approach, like, why don't we just go to the people, our colleagues within the same org, who like, this is what they're experts at. Like they are the best at this and they do it professionally. Like, we should probably just learn from them and maybe adjust it a bit if the needs are different. But I think rather than from first principles trying to think, how do we do this thing, why not learn from the people in your org that are like the best at it? So I don't know, I thought that was a great insight that I just wanted to like plus one.
Well, and I think the benefits are mutual because they help us, get running on Snowflake and we sort of learn from their experience. And in the recent months where Snowflake security has become an important topic for us to know about, like now all of a sudden we know what Snowflake is, we know how to use it, we know how we're using it, and so we're like we have alignment with them, right? Like we're all sort of like using the same tools. We're all working together collaboratively. We're just solving a different set of problems. So I find that like there's a lot of value from working closely with other people in your organizations and treating your security team essentially as an extension rather than an independent organization. Yeah.
Totally. So within the like nouns and invariants you talked about, by the way, I really like that framing. Like, what are the nouns in your company? So we talked a bit about EC2 standards in terms of like reverse uptime and things like that, improving base images. So GitHub standards in terms of branch protection, access model, SBOM, SAST, things like that. Are there any others you wanted to highlight?
So we think about devices, so like laptops that people have, and one of the ratchets that we have there is like device trust. So like accessing certain things requires that your device be at a certain level of configuration and things like that. That can be really important because one of the things that we've been struggling a lot with is like how to make sure that everyone updates because you have this. It's sort of I always like places where like security and user experience can win together, but like updates where you need to reboot is like one of those places where it's really sort of a zero sum game. Like people hate rebooting, and for updates to happen in certain cases you need to reboot, and so then it's like this like it's not everyone. Some people, like, as soon as they see there's this update available, they're like, oh, yeah, I'm going to apply that. And I think, honestly, like, a lot of people on security teams are those types of people. But, like, there's also a lot of people, like, executives, finger pointing or whatever, but, like, people who just, like, their time is super valuable. And they're like, I don't want to update. I'm going to basically wait as long as I can until it forces me to update. And so, like, yeah, figuring out a ratchet that works there, that isn't like disruptive. I think device trust is a useful sort of model for that. Another thing that we recently put into our security data lake, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to do more with this, is we have our vulnerabilities in there. And so, I mentioned things like validating our surface level objectives around with different criticality and things like that. But also noticing vulnerability trends over time, being able to look at different like classes of vulnerabilities. And I think that with these approaches, the data, the results are only going to be as good as the data that comes in. And that's actually really can be some of the hardest stuff for us, is to make sure that all the metadata that we capture around vulnerabilities, around incidents, is good, because it's very easy for people to forget to do that stuff. So like that's kind of, I would say, maybe a piece that we haven't necessarily figured out yet, is how to make sure that the metadata is always useful for us, so that like the resulting kind of analysis is still valid.
Yeah, data quality is tough. Okay, so moving on, last topic I thought we could just chat about very briefly before wrapping up is security conference talks and sort of the topics they focus on.
Yeah. I mean, I love a good security conference, and I am, I've learned so much from watching people's security conference talks. Maybe not as much as you,
You've got a life, so that's nice.
But yeah, I don't know. I think, the sort of context I think you and I were talking about with security conference talks is that, I guess maybe why sometimes it's not worth solving problems in ways that are like security conference talk worthy. You don't need to sort of like get an A+ in solving every single problem that you run across as a security team. And I think it can be dangerous if you start to sort of like, and frankly, I think this is like I'm saying this is a lesson that I've learned myself. Often when I encounter, a problem that doesn't feel like it has a clear solution, I sort of like want to be the Google result that I need. And so, I'll be like, what would it look like if we wrote a blog post about how to not do security questionnaires anymore, or something, whatever problem is it, I'm thinking of. And I think that could be really valuable to sort of like set a vision internally around like what does excellent look like, and how can we sort of work backwards from solving this problem, and like what an excellent solution would look like. So the reason why I think that it's important to temper that enthusiasm is because there's a lot of cases where you can get sort of wrapped up in details that don't matter, or you sort of end up over-investing in something that good enough is actually is fine for a variety of reasons. Maybe the problem is about to become moot in the future because something will overtake it, or maybe you are solving the wrong type of problem. So I had some examples of this in mind that I thought I would share, of just like things that we've worked on internally that like initially I kind of had this enthusiasm around, like, oh, we should do a conference talk around this, or like we should write a blog post around this, where I'm like, it was kind of like the enthusiasm waned as I realized that the problem itself was maybe or the solution itself was not quite worthy of sort of like doing the 1080 vertical and getting the gold medal so anyways, one of them was, we've been working a lot on sort of the supply chain security concept. We have sort of both sides of the supply chain. We have an SDK that we ship to customers, and then we also, of course, use a bunch of software. But like from that first perspective of like making sure that the software that we supply to people is trustworthy, we're like, well, there's a lot of cool work that's coming out here around like Salsa and SigStore, and so like, what would it look like for us to do some work to make sure that like our artifacts, sort of like have this Salsa validation, and so we did a bunch of work, like even like migrated our SDK builds from Circle CI to GitHub Actions, um, and then like we did it, and then all of a sudden it's like, yeah, the SigStore is signing, and like, and like I was like, okay, so like how do we talk about this? Like I was like, oh, this is gonna be great. Everyone's gonna like, because like I feel like it's still sort of nascent a little bit.
Definitely.
And yeah, it turns out that if you go and like you look on like npm and you look at our SDK, our JS SDK, you'll see like a little green check mark if you like go look for it somewhere. And like I'm sure over time that's going to get better, that there will be more build tools that allow you to do more sophisticated things with different levels of attestation. And maybe I'm missing something. Maybe like there are more sort of like clear benefits that I was missing. But that was just something where I sort of was like, wow, we could continue to walk down this road and really try to like show that we're at the forefront of this. But like it feels like the ecosystem isn't quite there yet. Like the adoption curve, we're like just too early. There's a lot of similar stuff we've run into in FedRAMP. Like we've invested a lot in getting a FedRAMP certification, and I've written some about it. It's been really enlightening to like kind of go through sort of the final boss of all security certifications, and a lot of lessons we've learned about how to sort of like solve problems that feel pretty challenging in a modern cloud environment. But I think that what we found is that every organization's sort of like FedRAMP journey looks very different. And it also feels like things are changing so quickly. So anyways, I want to talk more about it, but I just don't know that. So if anyone is out there doing FedRAMP and is like interested in learning about what we did or wants to talk about it, hit me up. I think my contact information will be in the show details or whatever. So let me know.
Yeah, I will definitely include that, your contact info there. But yeah, I like the point you're making here in terms of oftentimes, and I definitely fall into this myself because I love the ideas and be like, oh, what does the perfect version of this look like? But there'll be something like, well, there's this thing we want to address or solve. There's like the perfect, awesome, like amazing version of this that, you could write like a very defendable academic paper or give like a tier 1 conference talk on. And it's like, okay, we could do that, which is going to be, 1 or 2 engineers for like a quarter, maybe 2 quarters. Or there's the version that we could have like 1 person do in like a week, which is going to be like 80 to 90% of the value. And yeah, it's like a bit janky and there's some edge cases it doesn't cover, but like those edge cases don't happen that much and they're not a big risk to the business. And there's just like this order of magnitude different person effort needed versus like a very small linear like risk reduction or other properties that you need as like a security team. So I don't know. I think that's a good insight where a lot of the things you see written about publicly or talks, that they are that awesome version. And like, that's why they're shared publicly. But from a business point of view, given a finite headcount on the security team, given a million fires you could be working on, I like the way you describe it in terms of like, you don't need an A+ on everything. Like it might be better for the business for you to have a bunch of B's or like B- versus like 1 A+ and then like F's for like 5 things. Cause that's just like more likely to get you bitten from like an attacker or something like that. So
yeah, it's also really good, fuel for being a hater when you see someone and that's, you don't need to do that's too much. No, but I think what you said absolutely resonates with me, which is that like, when you see people doing something amazing out there, there's a bunch of stuff that they didn't do. And so I think it's super valuable for people to continue to try to innovate. But like what I've found is that, you need to be thoughtful about when you do it. And maybe I'm also sort of trying to, because I think there's there's some amount of like ego boost that you get, right, in the security community when you present at a conference or when you write a blog post or something like that. And so, sometimes when you're, uh, you know, just trying to sort of like get the job done, then, you don't necessarily get that sort of like exposure or that airtime. And that can be okay. As a matter of fact, that might even be the better thing for sort of everything except your bruised ego. But that's what are you going to do?
Yeah, a related thing that I don't think we have time to fully dive into now, but I just wanted to sort of mention because it's related is I've seen a number of conference talks or blog posts about people building a thing internally that is maybe still nascent, but is becoming like a product category, like an access service type thing or like a just-in-time permissioning thing, and I've seen some people post on LinkedIn recently about like we're building our own SIM or like something like that. And yeah, again, this would be a longer conversation, but I think my views on build versus buy have changed over time. I think it still does make sense to build sometimes, but I think for things that are suitably complex, like I think people who are builders underestimate like yeah, I can build the first version of this in like 2 weeks, no problem, and it'll solve 80% of this thing that this company is trying to charge us a lot for. But they're not necessarily thinking about maintenance. What if you move? What if the person who builds it goes to a different team? What if there is like a bunch of integrations you need to manage? Like those are super lame to build and maintain, and like other companies' APIs are changing. Yeah, I think the upfront 80% prototyping is like 2% of the total lifetime work for things like this. And what happens if like, I don't know, the whole company's using it and then there's a bug or there's some downtime and like you're the only developer of it and you're on vacation or something. So I don't know. I think for certain types of things, like, I don't know, if there's like a company of 50 people building this thing, they're probably going to build maybe a better one than you individually, even if you are in a 100x programmer. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's something that I've struggled with, and I've been involved with or led projects where we built something that like later I was like, oh wow, uh, that probably would have been better to not build in some way, because there is a huge amount of kind of like externalities that come with building something, um, and and uh, I still feel like I get drawn into this all the time
Yeah,
because
same.
I think like security products tend to be really opinionated, and sometimes like I don't like their opinions. Like I, especially, one of the things I'm imagining is like back when we were sort of like spinning up the GRC program that at LaunchDarkly, and like all the kind of like Vanta and Drata and various different tools for sort of like managing a GRC program. Um, I, I had a very different approach to the way that I thought GRC should be run, which was very focused on kind of like keeping things at the code level, and having like structured data that, anyways. So I ended up building something sort of from scratch to operate our GRC program, and yeah, I mean, I think the jury's still out a little bit, but like I'm actually very proud of the way that it works, and I think that also, you know, I think there is, from my perspective, a shift in the way that a lot of organizations are thinking about costs, and there is, a lot of these tools are very expensive, especially for
Yeah,
some of the value that you get out of
that's
them.
true.
And so again, if you can solve 80% of the problem, like it doesn't need to be a perfect solution. Like I am unlikely to sort of like give a conference talk about our GRC tooling at any time in the future, but like it actually, I think, kind of like solves the problems that we have in a very tailored way. And I don't know, maybe like I'll grow to, or the organization will grow to regret that approach one day. But at the very least, I saved us, some money because, and I think similar things go to like, for instance, what we're doing with the asset security data lake. Like if you look at, Wiz or various other tools out there, like there's some overlapping capability. And like, I don't know, for me, like I think that because I have this background as a software engineer, it feels really good for me to solve problems with writing software and using software. Is like, it's super important to not try to reinvent the wheel, but I still think that like that can be a superpower for people, is the ability to go in and just say like, we're going to solve this in the way that makes the most sense for us. But yeah, knowing when to use that superpower is kind of the I guess the critical skill set that I guess keeps you from being a villain or something. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, totally. Well, yeah, Alex, this has been a blast. Thanks so much for your time. Yeah, is there anything you would like to leave people with? And yeah, where can people keep up with what you're working on?
Yeah, I don't know. You can like uh, request me on LinkedIn or something, or I'm on Mastodon as well on the InfoSec exchange. Uh, And yeah, I'm always excited to meet new people who are working on interesting security stuff. And so, yeah, I'm hoping this is kind of an opportunity to meet more people that way. And yeah, I guess the maybe a piece of advice or whatever I'd leave people with is just to like, um, always be open to learning. Like I found that is maybe the piece of advice I would like to offer myself. I've been through a lot in my security journey, but I want to sort of remember that there's always more to learn, and the best way to do that is by talking to smart security folks like yourself, Clint. So I appreciate your time as well.
Thank you.
And yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk
For
with me.
sure. It's been my pleasure. Well, everyone, thank you so much for listening and or watching, and have a great rest of your day, and see you soon.